So last week we started talking about what our response to racism, especially in the situation in our, sorry, I just ran, especially in our society. We had a little discussion prior to that, and then we started going through the timeline of events, and we started back in 2014, I believe.
12, I think.
Was it 12? And so we started with Trayvon Martin, and we talked about how racism, of course, is not something new, right? But we started following really the big points of that as far as timeline-wise. We went from Trayvon Martin to Black Lives Matter to all the way up to George Floyd. And we talked about how each one built onto the overall narrative, the overall story. That it wasn't just one event that really had this breakout moment back in the summer, but rather it was a story that was kept going. And because of what happened to George Floyd had all the elements of that story built into it, and so that's why it became such a huge thing. And so that's what we kind of ended on last week. This week we're going to talk about some statistics, and like I said last week, I don't know how long this is going to last. We might finish it tonight, we might have another week, because this is a brand new thing that we're doing, and so I never know how long these things last until after it's done. And then I know, because they're done. But we're going to talk about statistics, and the reason why we're doing these two things first, going back through the timeline and talking about the statistics, is because we need to be as informed as possible, so that when we're having these conversations, we can cut through the junk of what's being talked about, right? Because the goal of this is not a political discussion, but rather a gospel discussion. As Christians, we need to get past all the other stuff that surrounds it and get to the heart of the matter, which is their sin, right? And so that's where we want to go. But we need to know. We need to know statistics, we need to know timelines, we need to know the story, so that we can, when we're approaching conversations, we're ready for that. Okay? So, any questions so far before we get into this? No? Good. All right. Here we go. So we're going to talk about statistics, because this is the reality of it. So all these statistics should be in your papers there. And all of this comes from CDC stuff, and I give you all of the references as well throughout there. They're a little small, but all the references are there for every single one of these things. Okay? What I have found when every conversation where someone brings up numbers, I have a list of numbers in my phone. I have folders, and each one has different articles or different things on different topics. And whenever someone brings it up, I bring it up. I say, okay, this is what the statistics say, let's talk about them. If they want to talk about numbers. So it cuts through the junk, right? Mm-hmm. So this is overall stuff. I believe this is from the FBI, but that's not the reference there, I don't believe. But these are based on FBI numbers. And this is, it's the corrections, right? It's the correction numbers. So this is overall stuff. So all offenses, and it gives race, right? And these are all in percentages, because I think that's a little easier to comprehend than the actual numbers, to help us kind of just put it into perspective. So all offenses, you have 70% of all offenses are done by white, in that white category, okay? Then you have black is 26, Indian is 2, Asian is 2, and that's all they give. Okay, so they don't give Hispanic in this grouping. They just give these for whatever reason. I don't know the reason. They just don't give that number, okay? But for what we're talking about here, we're talking about, really we're focusing on more of the black and white issue, right? Rather than society as a whole. And you get the terminology, the POCs, or people of color. We're not really going into all of that. We're just kind of focusing on the the core of what's happened rather than the whole scope of it. Because I think once we understand that, we can deal with the whole scope as well. So these break them down into murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, and then we can just go down C, and you can kind of compare that the two biggest categories are white and black, right, as far as of crime. And so this just goes through, so you have all of this, it's just going through that whole thing, all right? Now for the most part, you can see that the white category has more of the offenses, right, for the most part. There are a few other ones. Murder or manslaughter there, you have 51% is higher. Same with robbery, okay, that is higher. Everything else though is higher, but I want you to notice the percentage, okay? For the most part, it hovers for the white category, except for murder and robbery, it hovers so far around 70%, okay? Usually between 65 and 70%. That's important for later, okay? So I just want us to recognize that. We continue on, and we keep going down again. It's roughly the same, right? Except you get down, it's in the 60s now, and then we get to weapons, prostitution, and vice, 56, 51, drug abuse violations, 71, but it's still within that 60 to 70 range, okay? So it's a little lower, maybe a little higher on the black category, okay? We get to this point, we see a huge thing in driving under the influence, so DUIs are higher among in the white category. And then, so gambling, this is like crimes with gambling, so illegal gambling, that type of stuff. So it's not gambling, right? But it's just crimes associated with it. And then you can, but it's still really in that area, right? You have little blips up, little blips down, but it's roughly in that same area. And it's really consistent also across the map, except for things like drunkenness, disorderly conduct, liquor laws, those things, offense against children. You see kind of a blip in the Indian community, but it's not huge, right? It's not like a spike, right? It's just like a little blip and then it continues on. And so, man, you're late and you're phone. No, I'm just kidding. And then you go down here, right? And you continue you see that same thing, right? It's the same stats across the board. So it's a consistent thing that we see, that crime is consistent in this area as far as within those numbers, okay? So now this is why we need to know those numbers, okay? Because this is where it becomes an interesting thing. So 13.4% of the population is black, and they make up about 26% of all crime. So if we took an average of that crime, right, it becomes 26%, okay? So 13% of the population makes up 20% of overall crime in the United States. Now that's a huge thing, right? Whereas Americans are 76.3% of the population, and they make up approximately about 70% of the crime, which that actually makes sense, right? About 76% of the population, about 70% of the crime. That makes kind of sense, right? And so this is a question that's really important. Why then is 20% of crime from 13% of the population? And this is where the conversation goes, right? This is what we start talking about. And so, so the question becomes: Black Americans commit more crime at a higher rate, that should be higher rate than other groups. The question is why. So now this is where the conversation goes, because on one side you have it's because of systematic racism. We'll get what that means in a bit, but it's about a system that is inherently racist, and that's where the conversation goes, right? Okay. So if that's where the conversation goes, now the question becomes, is that true, right? And so as believers, we should always stand up for justice, right? And so that's actually why we went through the scriptures early, right? We went through all the scriptures, Micah 6:8, James, we went through all these different scriptures to talk about. So as Christians, we need to step back and say, okay, what is the problem? And if we're hearing people saying, well, it's because of systematic racism, okay, so now the question is that true, right? And so the idea behind that is there are laws or there's institutions behind these laws that are creating more to throw off the crime. So cops are racist, right? There's more laws that focus on inner city crime, or if you're in a rural area and you get busted for a DUI, you get let go. But if you're a black guy, if you're white, but if you're a black guy, you would get arrested, right? So this is the thought process behind the systematic racism. Okay. Now the problem is, though, if we just look at those statistics, we're not seeing the whole picture, right? And so we're going to continue to talk about this. So let's talk about the whole blacks are pointed out. And one of the things that is talking about now is that they're killed, right, at a higher rate. And so in this whole idea of systematic racism, this is what's going on. And so this is just more data. And so approximately 7,300 black homicide victims per year. Okay, so in 2019 there were 14 unarmed black men who have been shot and killed by police. So this is 2019 numbers. It's hard to get the most up to date because usually everything's a year behind reporting, because that's usually how you work, right? You report on, and so for those numbers to get out. Okay, so 14. So out of the 73, 14 were unarmed black men that were killed and shot by police. Okay? So that means that 99.8% of all black homicides are done by non-officers. Okay? And that puts into perspective at least one aspect of what, higher crime. Right? Because we would think, or we should be able to see that as black crime is higher, right? The 26 to 13, right? That population to crime number. We should actually see a higher number of black individuals killed by police officers as well, right? You would think that would be a part of, and this is why it's important to look at statistics, just to see. Now, statistics aren't perfect, right? They don't tell the whole story, but it helps us understand a picture and gives us, if we take a lot of statistics, we start seeing commonalities. And that's why we're looking at these different types of statistics. And so what we're seeing here is we're actually seeing that you almost have what they call a non-number, right? The non-number is like this. When we talked about abortion a couple weeks ago, we talked about rape and incest numbers. And that was 0.15%. That's almost a non-number in the sense of statistics because it's such a huge gap, right? And so we're seeing that kind of the same thing. It's such a huge gap. But another interesting thing about this is the Washington Post started a database back in 2015 to map these incidences of unarmed black individuals being killed by police. And what they found is actually by 2019, it was down by 63%. So instead of seeing an uptick, which the narrative, right, we talked about the story, is that they're just being killed, that black individuals are just being killed by cops, and it's just like skyrocketing. But actually what we're seeing is actually a decrease, and a significant decrease as well. It's not just one or two, it's over half of the original numbers are going back down. And so that is one of those other interesting things. And continue talking about policy and policing. this had happened by Gallup back in June. They released these numbers, and so, come on in. You don't want that chair.
Rush hour traffic.
Yeah. Yeah, they were over in Phoenix. And so what's interesting is, so this is just a series of things. Another part of the narrative is that so the first part of it is police brutality, right? Talked about that. Therefore, disband the police, right? And it seems like it's that everyone's on board with that, right? Or if you follow the news, right? And so Gallup did this poll, and they asked several questions, and so we're going to go through those. Would you rather the police spend more time, the same amount of time, or less as they currently spend in your area? Okay? And this broke it down between Black, White, Hispanic, and Asian. And you can see Black Americans say between more and same, right? So if you put those two numbers together, 61 and 20, that's 81% saying at least the same or more. That's a huge difference than disband the police, right? And that's a big thing. Now you do have about 20%, 19, right, saying no, get rid of them, right? But the majority, and this is really important, that we understand that when we're talking to people, and as we engage with this conversation, this isn't a black and white thing. It doesn't matter who the person is. As we engage in this, if they say things like, well, the majority of people want to disband the police. Actually, they don't. They want more time in the community. And so this is important. So this is just that what we just said. 81% of Black Americans want police either to stay at the current levels or spend even more time in their communities. Okay? And then only 19% Americans want less. And so that's all we're talking about. So we already said that, but that's what we're kind of talking about here. All right. So how about frequency of seeing local police? Okay, so this is how often do you see police in your area? Now for me, the majority of the time I see police officers is when I'm driving down the road. Right? It's the sheriff going by, it's the only times I actually engage with the police here in town is when I have to deal with an issue that pertains to something that's going on. So I've had 3 conversations because of youth. I've had 1 meeting with the police in the town for when we first got here. I had 1 because of a parent, and I have 2 because of a parent. They were doing dumb stuff, and so for me, that's it. That's my interaction with the police, right? And so that's what this question is: how often do you see police in your community? Now, and it's specifically asking Black Americans, okay? So they see police very often or often. Do they want to? This is a want, right? So they want 10% say more. So they want to see more police. 56 say more time very often. So 10% say we want to see them more often. 56 say same amount of time. And then so you go see, they sometimes see the police, rarely or never see the police. Okay? All right. So they see, yeah. Yeah, so.
I'm curious to what states, what cities, what communities.
That would be a good question.
Yeah, because.
Yeah, where they ask this.
Yeah.
Yeah, because this is in urban settings. These aren't rural settings. So I know that much, but as far as which cities, I can't tell you.
I'd like to know of the 19%, how many of them had run-ins with the police?
Well, that's an interesting, I think we actually talked about that. But walking away from that information, it's just the solution that they're saying is more police active in the in the community, not less. And so, several years ago, we took the youth to go see, or to go into Watts, and the police station was actually where the church was. There was a freeway overpass, and then it was on the other side. You could walk to the police station. So right where Watts is, and Watts is not a city, it's a district kind of, it's just a neighborhood. And this police station was huge. I mean, this thing was gigantic. And so they built it specifically in that spot to be more involved in the community. And so what was interesting is I never saw a police officer in the daytime. We only saw them at night. And so they were more active at night than they were, which would make sense, right?
And I know in some communities in Washington State, they've done away with the large police houses, and they've put smaller ones throughout in different communities where, I know, like in Wenatchee in central Washington, they put one in the college because we had so much problem. And so they, they were doing away with the large facilities and putting them into smaller, so they could be in the community.
Right.
And they had a very strong presence in the communities, so.
Yuma has 3 Walmarts, and the thievery is so bad, they close them at 10 or 12 at night. The one in, on the west side of town, the very west Walmart, has a satellite police office there, and they stay open 24 hours, but they lock up all the cosmetics and stuff like that because that's where all the Mexicans come to get on their bus to go out to the fields. And there's a Wells Fargo there, and I woke up in the morning and looked out the window, and they were lined up around the Wells Fargo building, like hundreds of Hispanics waiting to cash a check. Well, and I saw it, I said, I walked up to the Wells Fargo lady when everybody got in, and I says, "Are you having a run on the bank?" And she says, "No." I said, "This Wells Fargo does more business than any in the state." Just because of that.
That's interesting. Okay. All right, let's go to the next one. So, are Black Americans more or less confident in receiving positive treatment from police? And so you see that 12% say not at all. So they see it as not, and so kind of going back to your question, not exactly, how they were treated, but you can see that about, 39% will say that they're not too confident to not at all confident. So about 39%, so that's a large chunk of the population that says they're not confident in being treated well by police officers. Okay. Now that all this is, again, this is perceived. Okay. So that's an important thing, right? This perception is, but if we look at all these statistics, that 39%, that's within how many people are crime stats, right? If we go back to those crime stats, that within that 20 to 30 range are those crime stats, right? So if we go all the way back up, so, right, if we go back here, for the majority, look at those crime stats. So we have those blips, right, that 51, 53, but look, 26, 33, 29, 30, 29, 25, 31. It's within that kind of range of crime. And when we get down here, it's that same kind of confidence level. So going back to Bob, your question about how they encountered, it's almost like they parallel. Now, can we make a direct correlation? No. But it's just interesting. It's one of those interesting things as we look at statistics. Okay. So, but then again, one of the things that we do have to notice here is there is, from a white perspective, right, more confidence in the police than it is in any other category. Right? So that is an important thing. All right? So we need to recognize that. We do need to recognize things that are there. Okay? So, but one of the last things is overall, you actually have a very high rate of confidence in the police. Right? 48% of all. So, and that's mostly because you have, I mean, look at that, 56-40 for white and Hispanic. Those are pretty high numbers, right? But even then, you drop down to that somewhat confidence. And within white and Hispanic, 35-37. And in black, it's 43. Right? Asian Americans is 54. So it's really interesting that you have such a high number of at least somewhat confident. So it's not as if everyone is against police, right? That's what we're trying to show here, yeah.
I wonder how much of that is perceived. You know,
Well, all of this is
the
perceived.
news, and they make these assumptions, and so that makes your...
Right, well, the polls are always perceived. Yeah, it's not necessarily based on any actual numbers. That's why we gave the statistics first, right, of some of the stuff. But this is all perceived. And so, but we need to take this and kind of put that against the numbers and see what's actually happening. So, and we can kind of see that within that no confidence and within that crime rate, it's very similar. So people and this is just a hypothesis, right? That the more you're into crime, the less likely you're going to view police officers in good light.
That's true.
Right? But again, though, the thing here, though, is we have 70% of crime done by whites, right? But we don't see that actually reflected in the perception. Okay? So this is one of those things that there has to be more, right? There has to be something else going on. That there is a cultural thing here as well. Okay? So this is why we're looking at statistics, right? It's not just to see, but we actually see what are the reasons behind the perceptions that we hold, right? So there has to be other perceptions, other things going on than just, okay, so if 70% of the crime is done by whites, but roughly, if we go back there, right, we have, that's over 70% of the white category saying they're at least somewhat confident in the police handling, right? So that's over that number, okay? Where it's the reverse, right, or the other side. And these are just, again, observations. There's nothing, we can't say that these are correlations, right? Okay, just want to make that, you're smirking. Yeah.
I was going to be a statistician, so I know all of the.
Yeah, so you gotta be real careful that you don't take a stat and say, this is, right?
It's not gospel.
It's not, it really isn't. It's, all they're there is to kind of help us kind of get an idea and start asking better questions, right? And that's really what, we should never look at a stat and say, that stat is gospel, right? But rather, okay, here are some statistics, how does that help me have better questions, better conversation than I had before, right? Because telling someone, well, the black crime rate is way out of whack. So something's wrong with you blacks, right? That you have a problem. That doesn't help anything,
No.
right? Instead, okay, why? Why is that crime rate so high, right? That's a huge thing.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If the white crime rate is higher, but yet whites have a higher expectation of police,
Not expectation,
Well-
but rather confidence.
confident, okay. So could that possibly be because some people know that if they break the law, they deserve something? And
Well,
some people might think
So
they're
there,
getting picked on?
okay, so the answers to the question, right? So if you're in the black community, what we're hearing is that it's because systematic racism.
Right,
That's why.
right.
So you're white, so you can have more confidence because you know you're not going to get in trouble.
No,
Yeah.
well, that's what they're perceiving.
Yeah, so that's a perception.
Right.
Right. From the other side of it, I've heard, well, it's because you guys don't have respect for authority. So black people don't have respect for authority. Like that reasoning. Okay, so we can start hypothesizing, but once you say this is the reason, we're not taking everything into account. And so that's the problem, is that the whole conversation is really built on perception, right? And not looking at every single aspect, because this is such a huge thing, right? So if there's police brutality, is it, and then, so let's grant that right now, okay, let's just say, there's police brutality and specifically against black individuals, right? So if we grant that, for the sake of argument, now you have to ask another question. Is it because they are black, right? Is it a race issue at this point? Or is it a economic issue, right? Even when you grant one thing, it still opens you up to a whole slew of other possibilities that you need to ask. And so when we're just starting at the beginning, we're at this huge point. And for anyone to say it's because of this is not looking at the entire thing.
There's too many variables.
Yeah, there's way too much variables, and we're actually seeing that right now. That's why we're going through all these different things.
And my experience is being a country boy outside of Chicago, you get a ticket in Chicago, you give them a license with a $20 bill. This was back in the 1960s. So, but if the black guy got it, then he probably, I don't know what they did. But then
$40.
It's possible.
Jail.
So
It's possible.
the town of DeKalb, in 10 miles from where I grew up, was population 40,000 people. There was not any black people in it. The next town over, Sycamore, took all the black people. DeKalb took the hillbillies and the whites, and the other town took all the blacks. So I was in a lily white community. I didn't know a black person until I got out of high school. I didn't no interaction with them. And then I lived in Atlanta. Well, that's a different culture altogether. There was a town called Forsyth, Georgia, and that's a county. And the sign said, the county road sign there, and this was back in the 80s, said, "Don't let the sun set on you in Forsyth County," which meant there was no blacks after dark in Forsyth County. And Oprah Winfrey did a program from Forsyth County to give them a black eye for doing that. So, it would be interesting if you were a police officer trying to get your education and get a master's degree to do all this for nationwide and say where you could make, like say, statistics say whatever you wanted if you were in New York, Atlanta, Chicago, or
Right.
DeKalb, Illinois.
Well, and so we're not going back into the whole history of the United States, but there are Jim Crow laws, or there were Jim Crow laws. There has been, and when we get to the definition of systematic racism, there really has been. We're not getting into that, but there really, systematic racism is, the concept is that there are laws put in place by governments to be racist. And there has been, right? Segregation, I mean, those laws are based in race. And so, but we're not going back that far. And the reason why is because we're dealing with the conversation as it is now. Now, we can do that. We can go back. But we'll be going back 500, 600 years.
But there's still no blacks in the town I grew up in.
Oh, really?
It's only a population of 2,000, but there's not a black family in there. I think he might be able to find one. If he was there for a while, and he did, you know, and he was such a minority, he left with his family. The next town over took the blacks, truck drivers. So,
Well, there's still places, I mean, Quartzsite is not,
Overrun with blacks.
yeah. In fact, at one point, there was only 2 black men in the town of Quartzsite. And one was Curtis, and he was coming here.
Curtis.
He lives over in Black.
Oh, okay.
Let's get back to this. So what we're seeing, okay, so 61% say they're somewhat to very confident, while 39% say they're not too confident to not at all confident, all right? So question or an idea here is an increase in police presence and good police encounters is helping the community, can increase the view of positive treatment, right? So better, and this is actually one of the reasons why, so us as a family, my family, we've taken our kids to meet police officers. Taken our kids to meet firefighters. This is why in a lot of schools, they have the firefighters come to the schools, right? And then they go through all the stuff. They go through the truck and they look at all that stuff. Or we've taken our kids to go to the fire station, right? And the reason why is because the more you're around something, the more comfortable you are with that, right? And so this idea of actually more police and more good police interactions, right? Instead of, so there's tons of videos that were going around of like one police officer, some black kids were shooting baskets and he came out because they got a noise disturbance. Instead of kicking the kids off, right, he just talked with them and played basketball with them, and you know, it was a good positive encounter. And so we see that, right, as encounters are good, the view of someone is also good, right? So if you go into a city, so I've been to San Francisco tons of times. I hate that city. I love the wharf. It's a great area. I love the attractions. I hate the city because one time I was driving down one of the ridiculous roads and people are turning left and that's where I need to go. So I turned left. I got pulled over and the cop said, "You can't turn left here." I said, "Really?" And he says, "Yes, there's a sign." I said, "Where's the sign?" He showed me the sign. It's like this little tiny sign, but there's all these things around it.
Right.
And so I hate that city because, but your encounters with that, right? Your own personal encounters, and that's what all these are. It's that perception. All this is perception. And so, does it matter that out of that 7,800 fatalities, black homicides, that only 14 were done by police officers? No, because as we see that encounter rate is so high, and so that feeds into it. You have almost half of your community not liking a group because of the encounters. Already there's a skewed perception, right? So that's a huge thing. All right. So this comes from a different thing. So overall, 15% of overall Americans are in favor of abolishing the police. So this is all Americans. Okay? Only 15%. This is done back in July of 2000, back in July, right, that time period. So that's a huge thing to put in perspective, first off. Only 15% are interested in abolishing the police, okay? And here are the broken down. So you have 22% Black Americans, 20% Hispanic, 12% white, okay? So, but again, it's pretty high within minority groups, right? That's pretty high. All right, I'm gonna keep going. This is broken down into political sides, all right? So 27% are Democrats, 12% of independents, only 1% of Republicans. Okay? Yeah, if you know politics, this isn't a surprise, right? Okay. What's interesting here, though, look at for age groups. 33% of 34 and younger. That's a huge thing. Okay? So when you take that with the other ones, it seems like the younger you are, the more likely, but the more likely you are going to view police as something that needs to be disbanded, right? That's what we see here.
Because they're always giving me tickets when I was 18.
Yeah, really? And you know what? Okay, so when I was 16 years old, I was driving down the road out of my town to go to school because I went to school about an hour away. And my truck was just a piece of junk. It was a Dodge 50 and it had a Mitsubishi engine in it. It was a piece of junk. If it got up to 60 miles an hour, the whole thing started shaking to where, and if I wasn't careful, I could go off the road. A sheriff pulled me over and said, "You are going 65 in a 55 miles an hour zone." And I said, I know I wasn't, because if I was going 65, I'd be in the ditch. There's no way that my vehicle can do that. I got a ticket. That same year, I was driving back on the other side of town. It was 11 o'clock at night. I had a job, so I went to school. I lived in Ione, California. I went to school in Stockton, California. I worked in Sacramento, California. I was driving back home at night, 11 o'clock at night. At this point, I'm 17 years old, so I had my birthday, right? And on my way back, and I get pulled over by local PD. And they said, "Why are you out so late, you know? And you have a light out. Here's a ticket." The 2 times, okay, I have one more story. I am a little later, I'm driving down, and I'm a nice guy. Driving down the road, and someone has their flashers on, right? I'm coming home, this time from school. I'm going the opposite way from my school. It's about 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night. We had a baseball practice, and so I was coming home late. And I come over this hill, and there's a car off, and it just has flashers on. So I thought, oh, something's wrong. This is the middle of nowhere, right? There's no cell phones or anything like that. And I pull over. And I pull in front, because you pull behind and it kind of freaks people out. So I pull in front so they could see me. I go to get out and these lights come on.
Oh.
What are you doing? I saw the flashers. I'm a sheriff. I don't need your help. Yeah. So the 3 times I encountered officers was always bad. And so for years, I'm like, I don't like cops. Because
Something else, but in that age group, you figure that, okay, from majority of people, at least in the past, by the time you're 34, you're pretty much out of college. So you get to where you're under mom and dad's rule, so you're policed by your folks. And then you go to college and you're still told by older people what to do, when you're doing it, and how you're doing it.
Right.
So you're sick to death of being policed by all these know-it-all adults.
Right.
So I'm surprised it's not higher.
Yeah. Well, and then about in your 30s, you've started your family, right? And you become the police.
You're the policeman now, yeah.
And you start recognizing, right, that, oh, yes, we need police, right? We need,
There is a purpose.
yeah. But as, you know, there's an old saying, right, that if you are not liberal when you're young, you have no heart, right? But if you're still liberal when you're older, you have no brain. Right? There's that. And the reason is, they say that is because when you're young, your passion, right? Your passion takes over.
Sure.
And if you're not passionate, something must be wrong with you, right?
Yeah, like when I was in the Marine Corps, I was in MP. So since I've been here this winter, I've had several guys with my Marine Corps hat ask me what I've done. I said I had a job that everybody loved. Everybody loved me. So then I told them what I was. Yeah, right, we loved you, right? Because they were 18 to 25 years of age, you know, in that rebellious age. And so they didn't like us MPs at all.
And so it's really, it's not so much about police, right? This is a common thing within that age group of authority, just being against authority. It's just a part, really it's a part of life. And so, this is getting off topic a little bit, but in our society, we've indulged that, right? We've indulged being rebellious longer than it has been in the past. And one of those reasons, I think, is because we've pushed back marriage to later and later, and so you don't have the responsibility. Men aren't as responsible as early, right? In fact, in other ancient cultures, men were in their late 20s to 30s before they could get married, where women were in their late teens when they got married, because the men had to be mature enough for that relationship. So,
When you was talking about San Francisco, the last time we were in San Francisco, they were doing the sitcom Streets of San Francisco. Older people know that. Well, we were there in San Francisco, and there was a shootout going out. And I go, oh, they must be filming. And so my wife and we were all, wow, they're filming Streets of San Francisco. Then we found out the next day it was a real shootout.
we had a cell phone.
That was before cell phones.
I know.
Okay, could you say that again? How did you say that? If you're not liberal when you're young?
When you are liberal.
If you're not liberal when you're young, then you have no heart. If you're still liberal when you're older, you have no brain.
You have
no brain.
No brain.
When you're
That's just a joke.
Cultures through the years have had a rite of passage for
Yeah.
males. You know, so you are a child, and then you have a rite of passage, and you're a man, and you know you're a man. You're treated differently as a man. Nowadays, there's no rite of passage. You just kind of this child for however long. You're this child, really.
Right.
And you
Yeah.
bumble
So
into
there's never a point where people respect you as a man
Yeah.
through this rite of
And
passage.
so when we get to the end of this, I think that is a huge thing, is manhood. I think that a problem with society is manhood.
Way big.
And so, yeah. And yeah, there's really no point of this clicking, right, over, where I'm a child and now it clicks over. But it's just interesting that we see that within these age ranges. And then when you get to 50, right, then it really drops, right? So it cuts in half at 35, which is a really interesting thing. It's not a gradual decline. It's not like, 35 and then it's like, I don't know, 25, and then, it's 33, bam, 16, bam, 14, and it's this.
4.
Oh, 4, yeah, sorry, 4. Yeah, so it's a huge, just drop. And so, but that's just one of those things that, again, this disbanding. So why is there such a disconnect, right? Like for your generation and my generation, why is there this huge disconnect? Well, what would be interesting is if we would have these same statistics back in the 60s.
Yeah.
You know, that would have been interesting things because back in the 60s, it was all about the man, right? That idea. And so it'd been interesting if we had those same statistics, which we don't, because no one was asking these questions.
I don't think anybody even thought about trying to get rid of the police back then.
Well, I'm sure there was, but I don't think it was on the
was
scale.
Scale of government.
Yeah.
Yeah, criminals might have been, but
I
Seattle's
think-
defunded the police, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I live in Washington, and it's like, and they're trying to, and in quite a few other places over there in Washington, they were trying to defund the police over there in Snohomish.
Well, they
They're
did in
fighting
Capitol,
In where?
up at, up north
Olympia?
of, no, in Capitol Hill.
Uh-huh, oh, yeah,
Yeah, they have
where
no-
they had,
yeah, they have no police there.
I can believe that.
Well, but
the social
so,
workers.
and going, so if we were going to do a history of this, we could probably trace this back to the 60s. I know we can trace it back earlier, but as far as like a big political movement, probably in the 60s, we actually start seeing those things with the clashes, right? And places like Berkeley and
Yeah.
Kent State.
In
Yeah,
in
Columbia.
rural America, where we live, everybody has great respect for our policemen, you know? And so, you know, like our county seat is like 2,900 people. And so most towns are like 200 or 300 or 500, 600. And we were coming back from a basketball game, and I was so hyped up because our team was playing teams that for our pastor, his sons played there. Our friends played against it. So I was so hyped up. I was going through town, and I didn't realize I was going 45 and a 25. The police officer pulls me over, and he goes, "Going a little faster, aren't you?" I go, "Yeah." I said, "We just come back from basketball." He said, "How did the basketball game turn out?" He says, "We won." I said, "We won." And I said, "I'm so hyped up, I can hardly, you know." He says, "Well, just slow down from now on, you know."
Well, you know, I had a conversation with a guy not too long ago about representative government, and we talked about how when the founders first start, you would know your representative. Like, you would actually know them.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, you would know your congressperson.
Absolutely.
A good,
Come to town.
yeah. You'd actually, you might play on the same team, you know,
Right.
type of thing, maybe not back then, but just the idea of you would know them. Same with in more rural areas, you know, like I knew a lot of the police officers in town
Sure.
because they're my father's friends or my friends' dads, you know. But when you start getting to the city, who is this person? And here in Quartzsite, a lot of the police officers don't live in Quartzsite. They used to. When I first got here, I've met all the police officers. I knew all of them by their first name. Now,
3 of them live on Malibu.
Yeah, some live right on the
well,
street.
they rent.
Well, yeah, but
Yeah.
this guy won't sell his house.
Yeah, but do they actually live here or do they?
No, they're
Okay,
there.
good.
Their families and everybody are with them?
Well,
No, I don't
there's
think so.
three single guys.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And a girlfriend, but
Yeah, but for a while there,
Is that the state police?
no.
No, we're
we're
town
not.
police.
Of course it.
yeah, I'm talking town police.
Okay.
Yeah, the state police, they have buildings.
They
Yeah,
have like a-
yeah. There's 2 little sections for them.
And they live there because they're waiting to get seniority to get on.
Right, yeah. But that, you know, it's hard when you don't know your police officers.
Yeah.
You know, and the bigger the city, the less you will, because, and most people want to live in a safe area, right? So police officers, they go into what they feel is more dangerous, and so they live somewhere else.
But it's also detrimental to the police if they don't know the people around them.
Right.
Yeah.
And so so again, when we're talking about this issue, we've already brought up a lot of other parts of this issue, right? That isn't race issues, right? And that's a huge thing.
Just a couple weeks after that George Floyd thing, we were in downtown Coos Bay, Oregon. And they had a block area of people on both sides saying, we support the police, we like, and they had flags for the police, they had the stars and stripes, and I mean, and people were honking the horn and giving the thumbs up, and it was really nice to see. And so it was, like I said, it was right downtown, and you know, there was a traffic light every block, and so it was, you know, you're only going 12 miles an hour.
Right.
It was,
Well, and then another thing we should look at is the politics here, right? Democrats and Republicans, so we'll just focus on those two, have different
Yeah.
belief structures in a sense of what their goals are, right, usually. Now, you do have, again, you have ones that are conservative Democrats, you have liberal Republicans, right? But in general, if you take the party stats or the party beliefs, they're very different than each other. And so that also plays into it. So it's not just, so we have age that's playing here, we have ethnicity that's playing in here, right? We have politics that are playing in here. So there's more to this conversation than just black versus white, or people of color versus police, or, you know, there's a lot more going on in here. And as Christians, we need to recognize that.
Well, yeah, 'cause- and for me, saying, you know, Christians, is what brings in the moral aspect.
Yeah, there's a whole other part to it. Yeah, it's huge. So there's so much more to this conversation than just what, especially what's in the media, right? And so this is one of those things that at the beginning we talked about, you know, not being pulled into a pure political thing as Christians. We're trying to get people to the gospel. We're trying to share that, because that, if we're talking from our faith, that's the only thing that is actually going to fix anything.
Yeah.
And so that's where we need to bring people, right? So, but we need to understand and it's better to be the most informed person than it is to be the person going, right?
Yeah.
Well, you have,
So-
if you have that attitude, you have more, better chance of being sucked in. to
And swayed.
faults.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had conversations with tons of people that they don't know. They
Yeah.
heard something on the radio, or they heard something on TV or social media, and that is the gospel. And
No.
it's not. And sometimes it's helping people get past some of that stuff and just showing this. I had a conversation with a guy on Sunday night after our sermon discussion, and he was talking about an encounter he had where they were talking about, and his encounter was with a guy, and he was it was during Obama's presidency, and this guy was telling me that he had read Obama's books, and the guy that he was talking to had not, but this other guy was pro-Obama, and he said, have you ever actually read his books? The guy said, well, no. He's like, well, here's the book, because he had the book. Here's the book, read it, and then we can have a conversation, because then we both had the same level of understanding. We can actually have a real conversation. And that's a problem, is when we encounter a conversation, one or another person hasn't done enough research.
Yeah.
Right? And so that can also give us some grace for them. You know, is to have that conversation, say, okay, how about together, let's look at this. And let's look at every aspect. Let's not just, we'll look at everything, and together we'll talk about this. And so that way it's more of a discovery thing rather than, when I talk to teenagers, I go, and they ask me a Bible question, I said, well, let's look at what the Bible says. And we open the Bible together and say, these are the what's the word? The scriptures that we need to look at, you know. And we go through those, and then we look at not just a verse, but we look at the entire passage so we know what it says, right? And so it's things like that. It's doing these conversations together. All right, but let's continue on with the stats. I don't have my. Oh, I have that. Okay, we're only going to do this next one because we're already at 7 o'clock. Okay, so we'll do this one and then we'll stop. So, do people feel there needs to be changes to the police? Okay, so look at that overall. 58% overall of Americans say major changes. That's really interesting. Okay, that it's an overall more than half the country. Okay, but if we break those down, before we break them down, look at minor changes. 36%. That's a huge thing too. That's saying that's over 90% of the country saying there are issues that we need to address.
So this is a poll, and these are perceived issues.
Yeah, this is all perception again. Yeah, this is all perception. This is a Gallup poll.
Yeah.
And so they did this was a huge survey, but again, it is perceived. But just that perception, 90% of people agree that there are changes, whether major changes or minor changes, but they do agree that changes should be made within policing. Now, would we agree with that? That there are at least some changes that need to be made in policing?
Yes.
Yeah, because, and the reality is, should there be changes in everything to make it better?
Of course.
And all the time.
And all the time, yeah.
Things have to change as life goes on.
Right. It's like, okay, back in the 1980s, you had, I think it was the 80s, you had the big shootout down in LA. It was an FBI shootout. And that really changed policing in general, both for the FBI and for law enforcement in general. That's when you started seeing more police officers with vests on, and it really changed everything, right? And as time goes on, things change because things change. Technology change. The cameras. I think the cameras are a great addition to policing. I mean, I know people that have to wear cameras for not just for policing, but other things because they encounter people in the community and this to protect themselves. They wear a camera all the time, and so it's just that's technology. So we should always be in favor of change as long as it's needed and it does good, right? Change for change's sake is not good.
Yeah, if you got one cop and you got 3 guys testifying against him, and there's no cameras,
Right.
I'm talking like in the 60s, 70s.
Yeah, and that helps the other way too, right? And that helps with if there is. So we're talking about let's say police brutality. The camera helps with that. One, it keeps good people. It proves their innocence, right? And it keeps bad people from doing bad things. Well, at least we'll try to help, right? And then you can get those people that are, whether it be the criminal or the police officer, right? So, but if we start breaking down, we can see that white Americans are the least likely to say major changes, but they still believe at least changes, right? We're still 50 to 40, Yeah, you're still at 90%.
But that knee-jerk reaction to just say, oh, we gotta change right now everything
We have to
that happened this
disband.
summer was, not productive at all.
Yeah, but as we've seen, it's been building, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not so much a knee jerk, but the extremeness of it
Yeah, the drug.
is the what's so crazy about it, right? But again, so this breaks it all down. Major changes, 89% compared to 14% of Democrats versus Republicans. And then almost the reverse, right? Now, you do have Republicans saying no changes. And I wonder about that number. I wonder if it's because this is in July, if that's a response of against the disbanding. If so many say no changes because it's a response to, well, they just want to get rid of them, so I don't want any changes, right? So I wonder that because it's such a different number.
Yeah, because if that had been done in, say, May or April,
Yes.
I'm gonna put the numbers.
Right, yeah. And so, yeah, so it's interesting about some of these numbers. Again, this is why you can't take statistics as final on anything, but just to help us kind of see patterns. But then we get down to the age range.
Yeah.
And what's interesting again with these age ranges, this is not a race. It's not done by race, it's done by ages. And so of all ages, I mean of all races, right, of all ethnicities, when you get to that 40 and, or the 35 and up, you start seeing a decline, right? But it's that 18 to 34 range is really, again, the younger group really wants changes.
Well, again, where is their information source coming from?
Right.
School,
Well, media.
Facebook.
Social media.
Yeah.
you know, that's where they get their information.
Yeah, and in fact, really, with this whole thing, right, you can actually follow this by social media. We talked about 2012, the Trayvon Martin. 2010 is when social media really starts going. By 2012, people start having cell phones in their pocket that are not just to call, but to record and to share social media. And so you really start seeing this within that realm. And I remember when all of it first started and they were doing, because I was solely focused on youth ministry, and going through all the different psychological things that comes from social media. And it really is a detriment, not really to anyone, but especially to those that are 25 and younger. It actually rewrites your brain chemistry in a lot of ways. So that's an interesting thing.
Really?
Yeah. Look up Google brain chemistry and social media. And there's have been a lot of studies done about how it can actually mess with your mind. Children are real bad. It's one of the reasons we, for years, didn't allow our children to use, they still can't use social media, but just like a phone. And now they're only allowed to do it like a video game, and only for a certain amount of time. And they have to earn that time through schoolwork and through chores. But it's very, especially social media, Twitter, YouTube, that type of media, TikTok, all these different things. Those things are actually really detrimental to young minds.
Talking about that, I've seen smartphones, big smartphones given to 2- and 3-year-old
Yep.
kids, and they are so fast.
Yeah, they learn it because the younger you are, the quicker you are to advance your understanding.
I mean, they can type 100 words a minute.
Yeah. But the problem is it changes their, it heightens aggression. It does a lot of things to the mind. I always tell when I was working with parents and they would have problems with their kids, first thing I'd ask them is, what's their social media usage? And 90% of them were, they're on it.
There's child pornography in Twitter.
Oh yeah, it's everywhere. There's softcore pornography on YouTube and in ads. That I had a conversation with 2 guys and we were talking about this. They're like, because I brought it up. I'm like, I was watching this video, and most of the videos I watch are like theological stuff. I just put it on and I just do my work and listen to it. And this this ad comes on. It's softcore porn. And I'm like, what? So I asked them about it, and they're like, oh yeah, like if you even watch a video that's even close to something, the ads will just come on. And it's like,
Yeah.
children can, you know.
Yeah.
One of the guys says his mom was playing Candy Crush, and one came on. And that's nothing, you know. That's
Yeah.
like a kid game. But yeah, so it's bad.
Yeah, it's a
But
big-
it's interesting though, the more, you know, this could be another one of those things, the more social media usage you have, the higher maybe.
Yeah.
You know, again, it's just another factor into this whole thing. So yeah, so ending on this, we have overall 58% of Americans believe major changes need to be made, so that's a huge number, right? 36 believe that minor changes, and 6% believe no changes. And that should tell us something, just in the sense of, at least there is a point of agreement, right? And so a lot of times when I've had conversations with people, it's especially those that want to say disband the police or something along those lines, they have it in their minds that you're automatically an adversary, right? But stuff like this can help us say, well, wait a second, do you know me? Or are you just believing what you're saying on social media?
Yeah.
And that's a huge thing. To have a conversation with someone and actually have that with that person. A person is not a statistic, right? A person has their own thoughts and ideas. And so as Christians, we need to have the conversation rather than the battle. Of getting that past that point of, hey, well, let's talk. Do you know my ideas, right? So talk to me as an individual. Don't look at me as a statistic, right? Statistics are good. It kind of give us an idea. But even the statistics that we've shown tonight are, well, there's 90% of people are in this camp of, there are changes that do need to be made with policing. So let's talk about that. Let's actually have a conversation here. You know, instead of just saying, well, we need to disband. Okay, well, let's talk, right? And get past, that's one of those things that it's an entry point into gospel conversations, is first and foremost, it's an individual thing, right? And so, yeah. All right, so we're gonna end there. And then next week we'll talk about terms. And we'll talk about the systematic racism and all these different terminologies as well. And we're about, as far as slides are concerned, we're about halfway through. So this might be another week, probably 2 at the most. Okay. So, any last thoughts before we end tonight? Just kind of what we talked about.
I have a friend whose son is a police officer in Portland. And he was one of those that was stuck in that building that they...
The federal building?
Yeah, the federal
Or
building.
the precinct?
That they went and, locked them all up or fixed it. Anyway.
Yeah, I think that when you get into dialogue with people, with their ideas and so forth, that you have to find out what's their backstory. Like, when Bob's growing up in a 100% totally different environment than I did. I was the minority. I mean, I lived in a very rural part, and everyone, we lived, our whole community, where we lived, our housing development was on 5, 10, and 15 acre tracts. And it was just my family and another white family, and we're the ones that had the 5 acre tracts. All of the Asians and the, I don't remember there being too many Hispanics, but anyway, the blacks had the biggest tracts. They had the biggest houses for where I grew up. So I was the minority, and so I mean we, you know, my family was always in trouble with the black family because our property looked the worst because my big brother liked to get dumpy trucks and cars, and where they died they stayed, and that wasn't really permitted. The blacks wanted the neighborhood to look my trash, my family was and then to boot it too, my father was the head deacon of the biggest church in town, so we, you know, it's like, yeah, we had a reputation. Yeah, so I mean, and so I grew up, you know, totally different than how Bob grew up. So his backstories and his history is totally different than with mine.
There was no black people on TV in 1955. I mean, I was completely sheltered.
Yeah, and so it just, you know, and so, I mean, I grew up in a different time frame and a different time bubble than what you grew up in, and with, you know, so it's, and so that's important. That's all I'm saying, is that when you start a dialogue, you need to ask the person and say, okay, what is your backstory? What is your history? What kind of interaction have you had with different race? What interaction have you had with police? You know, have you had any positive interaction with police, or has it been all negative? And that's going to change your view on everything and what your backstory is.
Oh, sure.
And we've had this conversation before about, in apologetics in general, is we should always understand where someone's coming from, because that actually helps us share the gospel in a better way, right? And this is really shown with Paul, where with the Jews he talked a certain way and he brought up certain things because they would respond to certain things, and with the Gentiles he went a different approach because they had a different mindset. And so when we start understanding someone, it helps us share the gospel better. Because we can start understanding who they are and be able to do just that. And so it's the same thing with this, where our goal is to share the gospel, because, and the reality is the root of all of this is sin. And so we have to deal with all this, but we have to deal first with sin. That is the problem. And so to understand someone really helps go through all that. And there's a lot of pain and suffering too. And so have to deal with that as well. And so. All right, well, let's pray and then we'll be done for the evening. Heavenly Father, thank you for tonight. Thank you for the time that we've spent. Lord, as we're interacting in our society, help us to be able to have these conversations, have these ways of insight into people's lives that we couldn't know ourselves, and help us with our conversations, to be able to bring up things that need to be brought up, to not bring up things that don't have a point. Help us by your Spirit to cut through the minutia that is all around this whole thing, and cut to the heart of the pain and hurt that's going on, and that we can bring the gospel to it. Lord, you are the only one that saves. And so we turn this over to you. So any conversations we have, help us to be able to point back to you, back to the cross and the salvation that is only through that. And so help us do it. And I ask, as we're all going home tonight, you protect us so we can get home and be able to have these conversations later. I ask this all in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen.